His struggles, his privations, his hard work to raise himself in the social scale had filled him with such an exalted conviction of his merits that it was extremely difficult for the world to treat him with justice, the standard of that notion depending so much upon the patience of the individual. The professor had genius, but lacked the great social virtue of resignation. Intellectually a nonentity, Ossipon pronounced aloud, abandoning suddenly the inward contemplation of Mrs. Verloc's bereaved person and business. Quite an ordinary personality. Did he say anything to you? Give you some idea of his intentions? I hadn't seen him for a month. It seems impossible that he should be gone. He told me it was going to be a demonstration against a building, said the professor. I had to know that much to prepare the missile. I pointed out to him that I had hardly a sufficient quantity for a completely destructive result, but he pressed me very earnestly to do my best. As he wanted something that could be carried openly in the hand, I proposed to make use of an old 1-gallon copal varnish can I happened to have by me. He was pleased at the idea. It gave me some trouble because I had to cut out the bottom first and solder it on again afterwards. When prepared for use, the can enclosed a wide-mouthed, well-corked jar of thick glass, packed around with some wet clay and containing 16 ounces of X2 green powder. The detonator was connected with the screw top of the can. It was ingenious, a combination of time and shock. I explained the system to him. It was a thin tube of tin enclosing a... Ossipon's attention had wandered. "What do you think has happened?" he interrupted. "Can't tell. Screwed the top on tight, which would make the connection, and then forgot the time. It was set for 20 minutes. On the other hand, the time contact being made, a sharp shock would bring about the explosion at once. He either ran the time too close or simply let the thing fall. The contact was made all right. That's clear to me at any rate. The systems worked perfectly. And yet you would think that a common fool in a hurry would be much more likely to forget to make the contact altogether. I was worrying myself about that sort of failure mostly. But there are more kinds of fools than one can guard against. You can't expect a detonator to be absolutely foolproof." He beckoned to a waiter. Ossipon sat rigid with the abstracted gaze of mental travail. After the man had gone away with the money, he roused himself with an air of profound dissatisfaction. "It's extremely unpleasant for me," he mused. "Karl has been in bed with bronchitis for a week. There is an even chance that he will never get up again. Michaelis is luxuriating in the country somewhere. A fashionable publisher has offered him £500 for a book. It will be a ghastly failure. He has lost the habit of consecutive thinking in prison, you know." The professor on his feet, now buttoning his coat, looked about him with perfect indifference. "What are you going to do?" asked Ossipon wearily. He dreaded the blame of the Central Red Committee, a body which had no permanent place of abode and of whose membership he was not exactly informed. If this affair eventuated in the stoppage of the modest subsidy allotted to the publication of the F.P. pamphlets, then indeed he would have to regret Verloc's inexplicable folly. "Solidarity with the extremist form of action is one thing, and silly recklessness is another," he said with a sort of moody brutality. "I don't know what came to Verloc. There's some mystery there. However, he's gone. You may take it as you like, but under the circumstances, the only policy for the militant revolutionary group is to disclaim all connection with this damned freak of yours. How to make the disclaimer convincing enough is what bothers me." The little man, on his feet, buttoned up and ready to go, was no taller than the seated Ossipon. He leveled his spectacles at the latter's face point blank. You might ask the police for a testimonial of good conduct. They know where every one of you slept last night. Perhaps if you asked them, they would consent to publish some sort of official statement. No doubt they are aware well enough that we had nothing to do with this, mumbled Ossipon bitterly. What they will say is another thing. He remained thoughtful, disregarding the short, owlish, shabby figure standing by his side. I must lay hands on Michaelis at once and get him to speak from his heart at one of our gatherings. The public has a sort of sentimental regard for that fellow. His name is known, and I am in touch with a few reporters on the big dailies. What he would say would be utter bosh, but he has a turn of talk that makes it go down all the same. Like treacle, interjected the professor, rather low, keeping an impassive expression. The perplexed Ossipon went on communing with himself half-audibly, after the manner of a man reflecting in perfect solitude. Confounded ass, to leave such an imbecile business on my hands, and I don't even know if... He sat with compressed lips. The idea of going for news straight to the shop lacked charm. His notion was that Verloc's shop might have been turned already into a police trap. They will be bound to make some arrests, he thought, with something resembling virtuous indignation, for the even tenor of his revolutionary life was menaced by no fault of his, and yet unless he went there he ran the risk of remaining in ignorance of what perhaps it would be very material for him to know. Then he reflected that if the man in the park had been so very much blown to pieces as the evening papers said, he could not have been identified, and if so, the police could have no special reason for watching Verloc's shop more closely than any other place known to be frequented by marked anarchists. No more reason, in fact, than for watching the doors of the Silenos. There would be a lot of watching all round, no matter where he went. Still, I wonder what I had better do now, he muttered, taking counsel with himself. A rasping voice at his elbow said with sedate scorn, "Fasten yourself upon the woman for all she's worth." After uttering these words, the professor walked away from the table. Ossipon, whom that piece of insight had taken unawares, gave one ineffectual start and remained still with a helpless gaze, as though nailed fast to the seat of his chair. The lonely piano, without as much as a music stool to help it, struck a few chords courageously, and beginning a selection of national airs, played him out at last to the tune of "The Bluebells of Scotland." The painfully detached notes grew faint behind his back while he went slowly upstairs, across the hall, and into the street. In front of the great doorway, a dismal row of newspaper sellers, standing clear of the pavement, dealt out their wares from the gutter. It was a raw, gloomy day of the early spring, and the grimy sky, the mud of the streets, the rags of the dirty men harmonized excellently with the eruption of the damp, rubbishy sheets of paper soiled with printer's ink. The posters, maculated with filth, garnished like tapestry the sweep of the curbstone. The trade in afternoon papers was brisk, yet in comparison with the swift, constant march of foot traffic, the effect was of indifference, of a disregarded distribution. Ossipon looked hurriedly both ways before stepping out into the cross-currents, but the professor was already out of sight. Chapter 5. The professor had turned into a street to the left and walked along with his head carried rigidly erect in a crowd whose every individual almost overtopped his stunted stature. It was vain to pretend to himself that he was not disappointed, but that was mere feeling. the stoicism of his thought could not be disturbed by this or any other failure. Next time, or the time after next, a telling stroke would be delivered, something really startling, a blow fit to open the first crack in the imposing front of the great edifice of legal conceptions sheltering the atrocious injustice of society. Of humble origin, and with an appearance really so mean as to stand in the way of his considerable natural abilities, his imagination had been fired early by the tales of men rising from the depths of poverty to positions of authority and affluence. The extreme, almost ascetic purity of his thought, combined with an astounding ignorance of worldly conditions, had set before him a goal of power and prestige to be attained without the medium of arts, graces, tact, wealth, by sheer weight of merit alone. On that view, he considered himself entitled to undisputed success. His father, a delicate, dark enthusiast with a sloping forehead, had been an itinerant and rousing preacher of some obscure but rigid Christian sect, a man supremely confident in the privileges of his righteousness. In the son, individualist by temperament, once the science of colleges had replaced thoroughly the faith of conventicles, this moral attitude translated itself into a frenzied puritanism of ambition. He nursed it as something secularly holy. To see it thwarted opened his eyes to the true nature of the world, whose morality was artificial, corrupt, and blasphemous. The way of even the most justifiable revolutions is prepared by personal impulses disguised into creeds. The professor's indignation found in itself a final cause that absolved him from the sin of turning to destruction as the agent of his ambition. To destroy public faith in legality was the imperfect formula of his pedantic fanaticism, but the subconscious conviction that the framework of an established social order cannot be effectually shattered except by some form of collective or individual violence was precise and correct. He was a moral agent. That was settled in his mind. By exercising his agency with ruthless defiance, he procured for himself the appearance of power and personal prestige. That was undeniable to his vengeful bitterness. It pacified its unrest, and in their own way the most ardent of revolutionaries are perhaps doing no more but seeking for peace in common with the rest of mankind, the peace of soothed vanity, of satisfied appetites, or perhaps of appeased conscience. Lost in the crowd, miserable and undisguised, he meditated confidently on his power, keeping his hand in the left pocket of his trousers, grasping lightly the India rubber ball, the supreme guarantee of his sinister freedom. But after a while he became disagreeably affected by the sight of the roadway thronged with vehicles, and of the pavement crowded with men and women. He was in a long, straight street peopled by a mere fraction of an immense multitude. But all round him, on and on, even to the limits of the horizon hidden by the enormous pile of bricks, he felt the mass of mankind, mighty in its numbers. They swarmed numerous like locusts, industrious like ants, thoughtless like a natural force, pushing on blind and orderly and absorbed, impervious to sentiment, to logic, to terror, too, perhaps. That was the form of doubt he feared most, impervious to fear. Often while walking abroad, when he happened also to come out of himself, he had such moments of dreadful and sane mistrust of mankind. What if nothing could move them? Such moments come to all men whose ambition aims at a direct grasp upon humanity, to artists, politicians, thinkers, reformers, or saints. A despicable emotional state this, against which solitude fortifies a superior character, and with severe exultation the professor thought of the refuge of his room, with its padlocked cupboard, lost in a wilderness of poor houses, the hermitage of the perfect anarchist. In order to reach sooner the point where he could take his omnibus, he turned brusquely out of the populous street into a narrow and dusky alley paved with flagstones. On one side, the low brick houses had in their dusty windows the sightless, moribund look of incurable decay, empty shells awaiting demolition. From the other side, life had not departed wholly as yet. Facing the only gas lamp yawned the cavern of a second-hand furniture dealer, where, deep in the gloom of a sort of narrow avenue, winding through a bizarre forest of wardrobes with an undergrowth tangle of table legs, a tall pier glass glimmered like a pool of water in a wood. An unhappy, homeless couch, accompanied by two unrelated chairs, stood in the open. The only human being making use of the alley, besides the professor, coming stalwart and erect from the opposite direction, checked his swinging pace suddenly. "Hello," he said, and stood a little on one side, watchfully. The professor had already stopped, with a ready half-turn which brought his shoulders very near the other wall. His right hand fell lightly on the back of the outcast couch. The left remained purposefully plunged deep in the trousers pocket, and the roundness of the heavy-rimmed spectacles imparted an owlish character to his moody, unperturbed face. It was like a meeting in a side corridor of a mansion full of life. The stalwart man was buttoned up in a dark overcoat and carried an umbrella. His hat, tilted back, uncovered a good deal of forehead, which appeared very white in the dusk. In the dark patches of the orbits, the eyeballs glimmered piercingly. Long, drooping mustaches, the color of ripe corn, framed with their points the square block of his shaved chin. "I am not looking for you," he said curtly. The professor did not stir an inch. The blended noises of the enormous town sank down to an inarticulate low murmur. Chief Inspector Heat of the Special Crime Department changed his tone. "Not in a hurry to get home?" he asked with mocking simplicity. The unwholesome-looking little moral agent of destruction exulted silently in the possession of personal prestige, keeping in check this man armed with the defensive mandate of a menaced society. More fortunate than Caligula, who wished that the Roman Senate had only one head for the better satisfaction of his cruel lust, he beheld in that one man all the forces he had set at defiance: the force of law, property, oppression, and injustice. He beheld all his enemies and fearlessly confronted them all in a supreme satisfaction of his vanity. They stood perplexed before him, as if before a dreadful portent. He gloated inwardly over the chance of this meeting, affirming his superiority over all the multitude of mankind. It was, in reality, a chance meeting. Chief Inspector Heat had had a disagreeably busy day since his department received the first telegram from Greenwich, a little before 11 in the morning. First of all, the fact of the outrage being attempted, less than a week after he had assured a high official that no outbreak of anarchist activity was to be apprehended, was sufficiently annoying. If he ever thought himself safe in making a statement, it was then. He had made that statement with infinite satisfaction to himself, because it was clear that the high official desired greatly to hear that very thing. He had affirmed that nothing of the sort could even be thought of without the department being aware of it within 24 hours. and he had spoken thus in his consciousness of being the great expert of his department. He had gone even so far as to utter words which true wisdom would have kept back. But Chief Inspector Heat was not very wise, at least not truly so. True wisdom, which is not certain of anything in this world of contradictions, would have prevented him from attaining his present position. It would have alarmed his superiors and done away with his chances of promotion. His promotion had been very rapid. "There isn't one of them, sir, that we couldn't lay our hands on at any time of night and day. We know what each of them is doing, hour by hour," he had declared. And the high official had deigned to smile. This was so obviously the right thing to say for an officer of Chief Inspector Heat's reputation that it was perfectly delightful. The high official believed the declaration, which chimed in with his idea of the fitness of things. His wisdom was of an official kind, or else he might have reflected upon a matter not of theory but of experience, that in the close-woven stuff of relations between conspirator and police there occur unexpected solutions of continuity, sudden holes in space and time. A given anarchist may be watched inch by inch and minute by minute, but a moment always comes when somehow all sight and touch of him are lost for a few hours, during which something, generally an explosion, more or less deplorable, does happen. But the high official, carried away by his sense of the fitness of things, had smiled. And now the recollection of that smile was very annoying to Chief Inspector Heat, principal expert in anarchist procedure. This was not the only circumstance whose recollection depressed the usual serenity of the eminent specialist. There was another, dating back only to that very morning. The thought that when called urgently to his assistant commissioner's private room, he had been unable to conceal his astonishment was distinctly vexing. His instinct of a successful man had taught him long ago that as a general rule a reputation is built on manner as much as on achievement, and he felt that his manner, when confronted with the telegram, had not been impressive. He had opened his eyes widely and had exclaimed, "Impossible!" exposing himself thereby to the unanswerable retort of a fingertip laid forcibly on the telegram, which the assistant commissioner, after reading it aloud, had flung on the desk. To be crushed, as it were, under the tip of a forefinger was an unpleasant experience. Very damaging, too. Furthermore, Chief Inspector Heat was conscious of not having mended matters by allowing himself to express a conviction. "One thing I can tell you at once, none of our lot had anything to do with this." He was strong in his integrity of a good detective, but he saw now that an impenetrably attentive reserve towards this incident would have served his reputation better. On the other hand, he admitted to himself that it was difficult to preserve one's reputation if rank outsiders were going to take a hand in the business. Outsiders are the bane of the police, as of other professions. The tone of the assistant commissioner's remarks had been sour enough to set one's teeth on edge. And since breakfast, Chief Inspector Heat had not managed to get anything to eat. Starting immediately to begin his investigation on the spot, he had swallowed a good deal of raw, unwholesome fog in the park. Then he had walked over to the hospital, and when the investigation in Greenwich was concluded at last, he had lost his inclination for food. Not accustomed, as the doctors are, to examine closely the mangled remains of human beings, he had been shocked by the sight disclosed to his view when a waterproof sheet had been lifted off a table in a certain apartment of the hospital. Another waterproof sheet was spread over that table in the manner of a tablecloth, with the corners turned up over a sort of mound, a heap of rags, scorched and blood-stained, half concealing what might have been an accumulation of raw material for a cannibal feast. It required considerable firmness of mind not to recoil before that sight. Chief Inspector Heat, an efficient officer of his department, stood his ground, but for a whole minute he did not advance. A local constable in uniform cast a sidelong glance and said with stolid simplicity, "He's all there, every bit of him. It was a job." He had been the first man on the spot after the explosion. He mentioned the fact again. He had seen something like a heavy flash of lightning in the fog. At that time he was standing at the door of the King William Street Lodge talking to the keeper. The concussion made him tingle all over. He ran between the trees towards the observatory. "As fast as my legs would carry me," he repeated twice. Chief Inspector Heat, bending forward over the table in a gingerly and horrified manner, let him run on. The hospital porter and another man turned down the corners of the cloth and stepped aside. The chief inspector's eyes searched the gruesome detail of that heap of mixed things which seemed to have been collected in shambles and rag shops. "You used a shovel," he remarked, observing a sprinkling of small gravel, tiny brown bits of bark, and particles of splintered wood as fine as needles. "Had to in one place," said the stolid constable. "I sent a keeper to fetch a spade. When he heard me scraping the ground with it, he leaned his forehead against a tree and was as sick as a dog." The chief inspector, stooping guardedly over the table, fought down the unpleasant sensation in his throat. The shattering violence of destruction, which had made of that body a heap of nameless fragments, affected his feelings with a sense of ruthless cruelty, though his reason told him the effect must have been as swift as a flash of lightning. The man, whoever he was, had died instantaneously, and yet it seemed impossible to believe that a human body could have reached that state of disintegration without passing through the pangs of inconceivable agony. No physiologist, and still less of a metaphysician, Chief Inspector Heat rose, by the force of sympathy, which is a form of fear, above the vulgar conception of time. Instantaneous. He remembered all he had ever read in popular publications of long and terrifying dreams dreamed in the instant of waking, of the whole past life lived with frightful intensity by a drowning man as his doomed head bobs up, streaming, for the last time. The inexplicable mysteries of conscious existence beset Chief Inspector Heat, till he evolved a horrible notion that ages of atrocious pain and mental torture could be contained between two successive winks of an eye. And meantime the chief inspector went on peering at the table with a calm face and the slightly anxious attention of an indigent customer bending over what may be called the by-products of a butcher's shop, with a view to an inexpensive Sunday dinner. All the time his trained faculties of an excellent investigator who scorns no chance of information followed the self-satisfied, disjointed loquacity of the constable. "A fair-haired fellow," the last observed in a placid tone, and paused. "The old woman who spoke to the sergeant noticed a fair-haired fellow coming out of Maze Hill Station." He paused. "And he was a fair-haired fellow?" "She noticed two men coming out of the station after the up train had gone on," he continued slowly. "She couldn't tell if they were together. She took no particular notice of the big one, but the other was a fair, slight chap carrying a tin varnish can in one hand." The constable ceased. "Know the woman?" muttered the chief inspector, with his eyes fixed on the table, and a vague notion in his mind of an inquest to be held presently upon a person likely to remain forever unknown. "Yes, she's housekeeper to a retired publican and attends the chapel in Park Place sometimes," the constable uttered weightily, and paused with another oblique glance at the table. Then suddenly, "Well, here he is, all of him I could see. Fair, slight enough. Look at that foot there. I picked up the legs first, one after another. He was that scattered you didn't know where to begin." The constable paused. The least flicker of an innocent, self-laudatory smile invested his round face with an infantile expression. "Stumbled," he announced positively. "I stumbled once myself, and pitched on my head, too, while running up. Them roots do stick out all about the place. Stumbled against the root of a tree and fell, and that thing he was carrying must have gone off right under his chest, I expect." The echo of the words "person unknown" repeating itself in his inner consciousness bothered the chief inspector considerably. He would have liked to trace this affair back to its mysterious origin for his own information. He was professionally curious. Before the public, he would have liked to vindicate the efficiency of his department by establishing the identity of that man. He was a loyal servant. That, however, appeared impossible. The first term of the problem was unreadable, lacked all suggestion but that of atrocious cruelty. Overcoming his physical repugnance, Chief Inspector Heat stretched out his hand without conviction for the salving of his conscience, and took up the least soiled of the rags. It was a narrow strip of velvet with a larger triangular piece of dark blue cloth hanging from it. He held it up to his eyes, and the police constable spoke. "Velvet collar. Funny the old woman should have noticed the velvet collar. Dark blue overcoat with a velvet collar, she has told us. He was the chap she saw, and no mistake. And here he is, all complete, velvet collar and all. I don't think I missed a single piece as big as a postage stamp." At this point, the trained faculties of the chief inspector ceased to hear the voice of the constable. He moved to one of the windows for better light. His face, averted from the room, expressed a startled, intense interest while he examined closely the triangular piece of broadcloth. By a sudden jerk, he detached it, and only after stuffing it into his pocket turned round to the room and flung the velvet collar back on the table. "Cover up," he directed the attendants curtly without another look, and saluted by the constable, carried off his spoil hastily. A convenient train whirled him up to town, alone and pondering deeply in a third-class compartment. That singed piece of cloth was incredibly valuable, and he could not defend himself from astonishment at the casual manner it had come into his possession. It was as if fate had thrust that clue into his hands, and after the manner of the average man, whose ambition is to command events, he began to mistrust such a gratuitous and accidental success, just because it seemed forced upon him. The practical value of success depends not a little on the way you look at it. But fate looks at nothing. It has no discretion. He no longer considered it eminently desirable all round to establish publicly the identity of the man who had blown himself up that morning with such horrible completeness. But he was not certain of the view his department would take. A department is to those it employs a complex personality with ideas and even fads of its own. It depends on the loyal devotion of its servants, and the devoted loyalty of trusted servants is associated with a certain amount of affectionate contempt, which keeps it sweet, as it were. By a benevolent provision of nature, no man is a hero to his valet, or else the heroes would have to brush their own clothes. Likewise, no department appears perfectly wise to the intimacy of its workers. A department does not know so much as some of its servants. Being a dispassionate organism, it can never be perfectly informed. It would not be good for its efficiency to know too much. Chief Inspector Heat got out of the train in a state of thoughtfulness entirely untainted with disloyalty. but not quite free of that jealous mistrust which so often springs on the ground of perfect devotion, whether to women or to institutions. It was in this mental disposition, physically very empty, but still nauseated by what he had seen, that he had come upon the professor. Under these conditions, which make for irascibility in a sound, normal man, this meeting was specially unwelcome to Chief Inspector Heat. He had not been thinking of the professor. He had not been thinking of any individual anarchist at all. The complexion of that case had somehow forced upon him the general idea of the absurdity of things human, which in the abstract is sufficiently annoying to an unphilosophical temperament, and in concrete instances becomes exasperating beyond endurance. At the beginning of his career, Chief Inspector Heat had been concerned with the more energetic forms of thieving. He had gained his spurs in that sphere and, naturally enough, had kept for it, after his promotion to another department, a feeling not very far removed from affection. Thieving was not a sheer absurdity. It was a form of human industry, perverse indeed, but still an industry exercised in an industrious world. It was work undertaken for the same reason as the work in potteries, in coal mines, in fields, in tool-grinding shops. It was labor, whose practical difference from the other forms of labor consisted in the nature of its risk, which did not lie in ankylosis or lead poisoning or fire damp or gritty dust, but in what may be briefly defined in its own special phraseology as 7 years hard. Chief Inspector Heat was, of course, not insensible to the gravity of moral differences, but neither were the thieves he had been looking after. They submitted to the severe sanctions of a morality familiar to Chief Inspector Heat with a certain resignation. They were his fellow citizens gone wrong because of imperfect education, Chief Inspector Heat believed. But allowing for that difference, he could understand the mind of a burglar because, as a matter of fact, the mind and the instincts of a burglar are of the same kind as the minds and the instincts of a police officer. Both recognize the same conventions and have a working knowledge of each other's methods and of the routine of their respective trades. They understand each other, which is advantageous to both, and establishes a sort of amenity in their relations. Products of the same machine, one classed as useful and the other as noxious, they take the machine for granted in different ways, but with a seriousness essentially the same. The mind of Chief Inspector Heat was inaccessible to ideas of revolt, but his thieves were not rebels. His bodily vigor, his cool, inflexible manner, his courage, and his fairness had secured for him much respect and some adulation in the sphere of his early successes. He had felt himself revered and admired, and Chief Inspector Heat, arrested within 6 paces of the anarchist nicknamed the Professor, gave a thought of regret to the world of thieves, sane, without morbid ideals, working by routine, respectful of constituted authorities, free from all taint of hate and despair. After paying this tribute to what is normal in the constitution of society, for the idea of thieving appeared to his instinct as normal as the idea of property, Chief Inspector Heat felt very angry with himself for having stopped, for having spoken, for having taken that way at all on the ground of it being a short-cut from the station to the headquarters. And he spoke again in his big authoritative voice, which, being moderated, had a threatening character. "You are not wanted, I tell you," he repeated. The anarchist did not stir. An inward laugh of derision uncovered not only his teeth, but his gums as well, shook him all over without the slightest sound. Chief Inspector Heat was led to add against his better judgment, "Not yet. When I want you, I shall know where to find you." Those were perfectly proper words within the tradition, and suitable to his character of a police officer addressing one of his special flock. But the reception they got departed from tradition and propriety. It was outrageous. The stunted, weakly figure before him spoke at last. "I've no doubt the papers would give you an obituary notice then. You know best what that would be worth to you. I should think you can imagine easily the sort of stuff that would be printed. But you may be exposed to the unpleasantness of being buried together with me, though I suppose your friends would make an effort to sort us out as much as possible." With all his healthy contempt for the spirit dictating such speeches, the atrocious allusiveness of the words had its effect on Chief Inspector Heat. He had too much insight and too much exact information as well to dismiss them as rot. The dusk of this narrow lane took on a sinister tint from the dark, frail little figure, its back to the wall, and speaking with a weak, self-confident voice, to the vigorous, tenacious vitality of the chief inspector. The physical wretchedness of that being, so obviously not fit to live, was ominous, for it seemed to him that if he had the misfortune to be such a miserable object, he would not have cared how soon he died. Life had such a strong hold upon him that a fresh wave of nausea broke out in slight perspiration upon his brow. The murmur of town life, the subdued rumble of wheels in the two invisible streets to the right and left, came through the curve of the sordid lane to his ears with a precious familiarity and an appealing sweetness. He was human, but Chief Inspector Heat was also a man, and he could not let such words pass. "All this is good to frighten children with," he said. "I'll have you yet." It was very well said, without scorn, with an almost austere quietness. "Doubtless," was the answer, "but there's no time like the present, believe me. For a man of real convictions, this is a fine opportunity of self-sacrifice. You may not find another so favorable, so humane. There isn't even a cat near us, and these condemned old houses would make a good heap of bricks where you stand. You'll never get me at so little cost to life and property, which you are paid to protect." "You don't know who you're speaking to," said Chief Inspector Heat firmly. "If I were to lay my hands on you now, I would be no better than yourself." "Ah, the game. You may be sure our side will win in the end. It may yet be necessary to make people believe that some of you ought to be shot at sight like mad dogs. Then that will be the game. But I'll be damned if I know what yours is. I don't believe you know yourselves. You'll never get anything by it. Meantime, it's you who get something from it, so far. And you get it easily, too. I won't speak of your salary, but haven't you made your name simply by not understanding what we are after?" "What are you after, then?" asked Chief Inspector Heat with scornful haste, like a man in a hurry who perceives he is wasting his time. The perfect anarchist answered by a smile which did not part his thin, colorless lips, and the celebrated Chief Inspector felt a sense of superiority which induced him to raise a warning finger. "Give it up, whatever it is," he said in an admonishing tone, but not so kindly as if he were condescending to give good advice to a cracksman of repute. "Give it up. You'll find we are too many for you." The fixed smile on the professor's lips wavered as if the mocking spirit within had lost its assurance. Chief Inspector Heat went on, "Don't you believe me, eh? Well, you've only got to look about you. We are. And anyway, you're not doing it well. You're always making a mess of it. Why, if the thieves didn't know their work better, they would starve." The hint of an invincible multitude behind that man's back roused a somber indignation in the breast of the professor.